Hello and welcome to episode 11 at the House of Dissent podcast. In this episode, I will be discussing the works of two Latin American writers, which is chapter 12 of Radical Mass Media Criticism, A Cultural Genealogy. The chapter is titled Popular Culture and Mass Media in Latin America. Some reflections on the works of Jesús Martín Barbero and Néstor García Canclini. And this was my second contribution towards the book. Let me begin by reading an extended passage on pages 192 and 193, which sets out some of the key differences between Martín Barbero, García Canclini, and others within the radical mass media criticism tradition, thus discussed so far. Whatever the theoretical differences within the radical mass media criticism tradition, one issue that is agreed upon is that the media are influential in the production of meaning in society. The differences are broadly based on degrees of influence. Both the Frankfurt School and the political economy of media, for example, in various ways, perceive the media as instruments of power in the hands of an elite seeking to enforce influence, control, and domination over society. This form of control is mainly possible because the public are characterized by passivity rather than active resistance to domination. In the Latin American context, Martín Barbero and García Canclini offer a different approach towards media power. Both claim to varying degrees that popular culture is neither devalued nor a sphere where the public are capable of making rational choices primarily conditioned by a media elite, but rather is a space that is partially conditioned by the people for the people. In other words, the means of communication and elements of the content therein contain aspects of an historical experience relating to the people within contemporary society, and this is conditioned by the memory of the people and their culture. Finally, contemporary popular culture is defined in complex terms, containing various cultural forms from different spatial locations, interchanging with each other to create a new and often vibrant urban industrial form of popular culture. Now, the reason I wanted to include Martín Barbero and García Canclini in the book was to begin a discussion on the relevance of popular culture within the tradition of radical mass media criticism. All too often, popular culture is associated or conflated with mass culture or commercial culture. Mass culture is a product or idea of cultural elites to denigrate the cultural production of the people. Elites have historically used the term mass culture to signify vulgarity as opposed to the so-called true, authentic culture produced by the so-called creative artists, writers, philosophers, etc. And they used the term mass to separate themselves as individuals from the mob. For the elite, true culture was based on the negation of the mass, the negation of the ordinary people. This manifested itself in a dichotomy between so-called high culture and low culture, with the latter having no intrinsic or moral value according to cultural elites in the upper echelons of society. Commercial culture emerged with mass media, a product of corporate private organizations, primarily based on selling people commodities and ideas. Popular culture, however, is the authentic expression of the people. Examples of this is the trade union movement and the community expressions of culture in the United Kingdom, for example, such as brass bands or choirs that represent the feelings of the people. Or in the Latin American context, the complex communication of indigenous, rural and urban expressions of cultural practices that are a product of colonialism and resistance. Jesús Martín Barbero was born in Spain in 1937 but he lived most of his life in Colombia, moving there in 1963. He passed away in Cali, Colombia, in June 2021, at the ripe old age of 84. His book, titled Communication, Culture and Hegemony, From Media to Mediations, published in 1993, is one of the most engaging books I have read. And it's also the book that changed my perspective on both the production and consumption of mass media, a point that will become clear during this episode. Martín Barbero was a philosopher who specialized in communications, culture and media, and was interested in the production and consumption of media in Latin America. The key element in his work was to argue that the making of history, the creation of a nation and identity, belonged as much to the people as it did to the elites who controlled the means of communication. This position is in stark contrast to Karl Kraus, who once wrote in 1923, and I quote, "In the beginning was the press, then the world appeared." And this Krausian approach is akin to Adorno and Horkheimer's concept of mass deception, where the people are victims of media messages and capitalist ideology. For Martín Barbero, however, this was nonsense, and he placed the position of the people in a more favourable light, i.e. one that had power. And, moreover, Martín Barbero used the anarchist model of the people as his research tool. Allow me to read a passage from pages 194 and 195. To comprehend Martín Barbero's empirical study in Latin America properly, we must first understand the theoretical conceptual categories that are so central to his work. They are the people and popular culture, and they dominate both his historical and contemporary analysis. And going on, criticisms of the popular have always been based on ridiculing the activities of the poor, uneducated people. They were simple-minded activities, unworthy of the complex cognitive process of the rich and educated that was seen to be as true culture. We find this elitist expression of cultural differences within the Enlightenment of the 18th century. The Enlightenment view of the people, however, changed during the Romantic period, and emphasis was upon the idea of the people as a force for revolutionary change. However, the Romantics also argued that authentic people's culture was primitive and of the past. And as we shall see, this is problematic, because for Martín Barbero, there exists a continuity of culture that is carried forward historically to contemporary times, through migration to urban centres. And what is more, this process of cultural development is based both on memory and cultural imagination. And finally, recognizing the weaknesses in both the Enlightenment and Romantic movement, Martín Barbero invokes the anarchist approach to the people. Anarchists claim that it is through the struggle against the bourgeoisie in all its forms that the people's identity and culture emerges. Anarchists place strong emphasis on memory, particularly in the struggle for justice and meaning, which in various forms have been continuous throughout historical epochs. In this context, anarchists place great emphasis on the continuity throughout history and the links that are forged out from one period to another. And as Martín Barbero states, and I quote him, "This continuity is, for anarchists, not a mere tactic, but the source of their strategy. Anarchists think of political action as an activity of articulation of whatever fronts and modes of struggle that the people bring forward." Now, the main issue that Martín Barbero is concerned with are the concepts of mass culture and popular culture. Essentially, he offered a positive account of popular culture and an alternative account of mass culture to what had previously been forwarded. And he does this in relation to the following points. Firstly, Martín Barbero was influenced by the Welsh cultural theorist Raymond Williams, particularly Williams's concepts of archaic, residual, and emergent. Secondly, he was also influenced by the Italian philosopher Antonio Gramsci and his concept of hegemony. Thirdly, he proposes his theory of mediations. Fourthly, he outlines what is meant by the Spanish term mestizaje. And fifthly, influenced by the anarchist perspectives, he proposes a positive view of the people as producers of culture, as I have already outlined. And finally, when all the above are put together, Martín Barbero's uses Latin American melodrama as an example of the people making culture, and to which the audience recognize their own struggles through. And so, what are his thoughts on mass and popular culture? Allow me to read a passage from 196. As Martín Barbero has claimed, mass society simply became a new mode of existence, where the popular would continue to flourish. In essence, cultural production would flow in continuity with the past, blending with the present. And as Martín Barbero says, and I quote him, mass designates the way in which the popular classes live the new conditions of existence, and furthermore, out of the mass will emerge the new form of culture called popular. So, to clarify, for Martín Barbero, popular culture isn't mass culture, but rather a form of culture emerging from mass culture and of the people to create meaning in life. In relation to how Martín Barbero was influenced by Raymond Williams and Antonio Gramsci, allow me to read a passage from pages 200 and 201. There are three concepts that Martín Barbero outlines that help us to understand the perpetual interactive development of cultural structures. They are archaic, residual, and finally emergent, and they feature in Marxism and literature written by Raymond Williams. However, before we look at these concepts in more detail, it's worth mentioning that there are other concepts discussed by Williams that help us to understand Martín Barbero's work, and they are traditions, institutions, and formations. These concepts are discussed in the context of Gramsci's theory of hegemony in systems that have a civil society vis-à-vis the state structure. Hegemony for Gramsci meant that power and control by elites entailed consent to rule from the people, rather than a simple form of coercion of state control over the people. And as Raymond Williams states, hegemony is not only about manipulation or indoctrinations, but rather is, and I quote, a whole body of practices and expectations over the whole of living, our senses, and assignments of energy, and more importantly, our shaping perceptions of ourselves and our world. And to follow on from that, from page 201, it's in this context that Williams discusses the dominant, archaic, and residual and emergent. The archaic is of the past. The residual is formed in the past and is still in the cultural process as an effective element of the present. The emergent is the process by which new meanings, values, and practices are created. They are the defining features and the result of a complex combination of cultural practices and responses to hegemony under certain conditions, and this is what Gramsci called a war of position. So what we can see here is that the archaic and the residual and the emergent are a form of continuity throughout time. In relation to mediations and mestizaje, let me read this passage from pages 198 to 199. What Martin Barbero refers to as the mestizaje is a complex of cultural matrices that have formed Latin American national identity over time. Unlike the dependency theorists who claim that transnational capitalism was thoroughly dictating development, and of course this was partly realized by the cultural imperialism of media content and messages, Martin Barbero argues that transnationalism is but one part of the complexities of existence, which include indigenous popular culture and the populist nationalism invoked by various political governments that sought to shape Latin American culture. And quoting Martin Barbero, he said, "The recognition of mestizaje that constitutes Latin America does not refer to something that has happened in the past, but what we are today. Mestizaje is not simply a racial fact, but the explanation of our existence, the web of times and places and memories and imagination." And continuing, this is about fusion and mixing of cultures, primarily brought about by the urbanization that capitalism demanded. But it is also about the reactions against the brutal realities of slum dwellings, which was part of the preservation and part reinvention of traditional cultures, practices and recognitions. Finally, for Martin Barbero, mediation is the social and cultural process that functions between various levels in the field of communication, from different social groups affecting each other through to the mass media industry, who then recycle the passage of history and cultural meaning through genres in mass production. One such genre is in the Latin American soap opera telenovela, which is a product of the mestizaje, but also a product of history, continuity, memory, and imagination of popular culture that has been sculpted over time. So, a key element of melodrama, of course, is the use of music to enhance the emotional effects, to entice the audience to associate or sympathize or empathize with the character. In this sense, in dramatical terms, the melodrama would seem to be at odds with the types of social realism drama developed in the United Kingdom. Social realism is mostly depicted as the absence of music. It's starker. I want to end this part of the episode with a brief observation of Jesús Martín Barbero's concept of mediation and how it fits within radical mass media criticism. Like Karl Kraus in the 19th century and Adorno and Horkheimer of the Frankfurt School in the early 20th century, Martin Barbero understood the importance of language in the process of communications. In other words, he understood that communication isn't neutral because language shapes it. This, of course, turns into discourse and ideology. But the process of mediation departed greatly from Kraus, Adorno, Horkheimer, and the political economy of the media, in that Martin Barbero, with a partial nod to Michel Foucault, argued that power wasn't simply a one-way process, i.e. from those who owned the means of communications, newspapers, etc., because power is more dispersed. In sum, Martin Barbero was disputing the degree of media influence and effects associated with the dominant ideology, and argued that despite large media corporations dominating the landscape, there were clear acts of resistance by the people. Another example of this, other than melodrama, is satire. which Martin Barbero believed to be a cultural weapon in which to beat the elites with. Satire pokes fun at the rich and powerful, often in a savage and brutal way. And he provides examples from a Peruvian television of how it is both a political and cultural weapon of the people in the process of resistance to a higher authority. And it's no surprise that in dictatorships or dictatorial regimes, that satirists are one of the first to be victimized. Indeed, today, the Nasa indigenous people in Colombia use the internet to make satirical videos, some of which are aimed towards the Spanish invaders, the Spanish royalty, and the Catholic Church for trying to decimate indigenous culture. The second writer I'm discussing in this episode is Néstor García Canclini, who was born in Argentina in 1939. 2 years after Jesús Martín Barbero was born. Today, Néstor is 85 years old. Canclini fled into exile to Mexico after the military coup in Argentina in 1976, and his life has been dominated by regular travel across borders within Latin America, which had a profound impact on his thinking regarding culture and media. He is mainly known for his theory of hybridity or hybrid cultures, which I will discuss in a moment. But for me, it's a statement that Canclini made that is as important or even more so than hybridity, which is worthy of analysis. In his 1995 book titled Consumers and Citizens, Globalization and Multicultural Conflicts, the first chapter is titled Consumption is Good for Thinking. Now, like Martin Barbero, García Canclini places inequality at the centre of his research, and it is this which helps towards formulating his ideas on consumption. Now, given that Krauss, the Frankfurt School and the political economy of media theorists, and many others discussed in earlier episodes, saw the consumption of news or media in general as a form of influence domination on thinking in a negative way, then Canclini's statement seemingly places media research in a different place altogether. Perhaps on first viewing, or listening in this case, Canclini's statement has echoes of the American mass communication researchers that Hanno Hart critiqued in his chapter on the Frankfurt School in episode 5 of this podcast. The Americans believe that mass communications inspired the spirit of individualism, the essence of liberal philosophy and the central tenet of capitalism. And individualism was the safeguard against the collective spirit or the authoritarian system that operated in the Soviet Union. Communications for them was good for thinking, regardless of the messages, manipulation and propaganda being fed from corporate media organizations. But Canclini's statement and context are completely different. And before I explain why it is different, allow me to read a passage from the chapter titled Consumption is Good for Thinking. And I quote, "Proof that common sense does not coincide with good sense can be obtained by focusing one's research on consumption. In everyday language, consumption is usually associated with useless expenditures and irrational compulsions. This moral and intellectual disqualification is based on other commonplaces regarding the omnipotence of the mass media, which presumably incite the masses to gorge themselves unthinkably with commodities. There are still some who fault the poor for buying televisions, video players and cars when they don't even own a home. How can one make sense of families who squander their Christmas bonuses on parties and presents when they don't have enough to eat and dress themselves throughout the year? Don't these media addicts know that newscasters lie and that telenovelas distort real life? Rather than responding to these questions, no one can inquire into the way in which they are formulated. Nowadays, we see consumption as more complex than the simple relation between manipulative media and docile audiences. It is well known that numerous mass communication studies have shown that cultural hegemony is achieved by dominators who corner their audiences. Between them, there are intermediaries like the family, the neighbourhood, and their fellow workers. These studies no longer posit the relation between senders and receivers as one of domination. Communication is not effective if it does not include collaboration and transaction between both parties. And finally, he says, to make headway in this area of work, it is necessary to situate communication processes in a larger conceptual framework that emerges from theories and research on consumption. What does it mean to consume? What is the rationality for producers and consumers of an incessant expansion and renewal of consumption? Now, this is a rejection of Marxist studies of media communication of consumption, because for García Canclini, they had exaggerated the powers of domination. He accuses Marxist writers of reducing consumption to consumerism. The latter for García Canclini is passive engagement. But for consumption, García Canclini is seen as a process of rationality or critical engagement, which for me places his theory of consumption high up on the scale of radical thinking. Like Martín Barbero, García Canclini places popular culture at the centre of his research. To explain the importance of his concept of hybridity, García Canclini discusses and rejects two concepts in relation to popular culture. Allow me to read the passage from page 205, in which Canclini takes issues with one concept called inductivism. The inductivist perspective is associated with anthropology, which has predominantly associated popular culture with isolated rural communities, somehow untouched from exogenous influences, hence pure in form and structure. However, like Martín Barbero, García Canclini argues that indigenous peoples are not isolated, but rather an intrinsic part of the changes that transnationalism has unleashed on the continent, and that their impact on culture is visible in the sense that they form a part of the complex character of Latin America, no longer separate, but no longer pure. The other concept he's critical of is deductivism, and this is also from page 205. García Canclini's position repudiates the deductivist perspective on the study and impact of popular culture, which denies it any autonomy, seeing it as the end result of the process of domination and submission. García Canclini refers to this rationale as theological, because power, which is contained only in the hands of the ruling elites, is consequently omnipotent and omnipresent. García Canclini then argues that these two concepts ignore what he calls hybridization, which is a term to describe and explain diverse intercultural mixtures. Like Martín Barbero, García Canclini is greatly influenced by Gramsci's theory of hegemony, but García Canclini proposes a re-evaluation of hegemony in the modern or indeed postmodern contexts. García Canclini was clear that there had been an absence of research concerning the relationship between popular culture and hegemony, and he argued for a rethink of the theoretical boundaries of which hegemony had traditionally existed. Gramsci's theory of hegemony rested upon national boundaries. and García Canclini argued that this was no longer useful. Rather, he argued that the processes of hegemony can only be observed within a transnational cultural space. It's important to note that in his early period, García Canclini is placed within a Marxist tradition, but later he shifted his policy towards postmodernism. He was a reformist, calling on governments to implement media policies in the Latin American context that would emphasize consumption and rationality. He advocated multiple political perspectives towards change, and there's no doubt he placed the people and inequality at the centre of his thinking. But he has divided opinions, with some calling him conservative because of his turn towards postmodernism. That, of course, does not mean his creative thinking isn't radical. After all, to be radical is neither to be of the left or the right. When researching the chapter on Jesús, Martín Barbero and Néstor García Canclini, it was clear to me that I was engaged with material that both held in common with other writers discussed in this podcast, but also a departure so radically different. There was no doubt for me that both can be seen as part of the historical tradition of radical mass media criticism, but my co-editor John was far from convinced. John was suspicious of their positive accounts of consumption, of their claims that popular culture was situated within mass culture, and therefore resistance to domination organically occurred from the hegemonic position of corporate media control. John was firmly within the tradition of political economy of the media, being particularly influenced by Herman and Chomsky's propaganda model. Quite obviously, the Latin American writers did not share the latter's perspective. But I argued for their inclusion in the book for one important reason, which was their ideas were radical in the sense that they were challenging and upending media research orthodoxy in both Europe and the USA. In sum, this was a subversion on a grand scale in research terms. But before I leave, just a quick word on popular culture. In Stuart Hall's essay, Notes on Deconstructing the Popular, in the final paragraph, he argues that popular culture is, or should be, a space where socialism emerges. And Hall says that if this isn't the case, and I quote, "Otherwise, to tell you the truth, I don't give a damn about it." In the next episode, I'll be discussing the American writer Bell Hooks. Thanks for listening, and bye for now.